Today the theme is human rights of foreigners in Japan. So earlier we had a podcast with Professor Yuriko Moto, a colleague, and when we asked, is there pervasive racism or xenophobia in Japan, then she replied that there were all sorts of areas of discrimination in Japan against submerged minorities such as Koreans born in Japan. Or she may have mentioned also discrimination against women who are not a minority but the majority of Japanese. And today I have another colleague, Kathy Worden, with me, and she can introduce herself first. And she has a legal background, I think, to be able to discuss the human rights issues in Japan. So please introduce yourself, Kathy.
Hello, my name is Kathy Worden. It's nice to be with you today. I am a trained lawyer in the United States. I'm licensed to practice in the state of Oklahoma. I was a practicing lawyer in the area of discrimination, Title VII discrimination, when I was a practicing lawyer. I've been in Japan for 8 years now and have had some experience with the legal system, especially attending a conference a couple of years ago that was talking about the reform in the Japanese legal system. It's nice to be here with you.
So how have you been treated personally? And I can explain your appearance and things, and then the general treatment that you have received in Japan.
I think generally I have had what I would consider to be reverse discrimination. I think I have, because I'm blonde, I look like the ideal Western foreigner, that I have been treated better than, say, some friends of mine who are Asian foreigners. And comparing stories with them over the years, I think there is a marked difference in the treatment between Westerners who look Western and even Westerners that are from Asian descent.
Okay, so what do you think are some of the legal issues then surrounding human rights of foreigners in Japan?
I think the human rights of foreigners in Japan are tied to the human rights treatment in general in Japan. I think it all goes back to the legal system and what we like to say in the law, the rule of law. The rule of law is that everybody must obey the law and nobody is above the law. I think in Japan, or I should say, for the rule of law to be enforced requires a proper legal system. So any time that the resources are not dedicated to, in terms of manpower, judicial resources, lawyers, dedication of the prosecution to pursuing violations of the law, then the law, in effect, is not enforced and, in effect, doesn't exist. It may be on paper, but if there is no effect or if it doesn't change the status quo, then it's ineffective.
Okay, so as you know, Japan has signed all the United Nations and other agreements, for example, eliminating all forms of discrimination, and yet what is the actual situation of the implementation of those human rights ideals?
And I think that's where the legal system falls short in Japan. But luckily, whether it's the legal system itself that's perpetuated this, or the politicians, or both, or what I think is the outside pressure of the United Nations and other countries, just in fact because what you said, Steve, that Japan has signed all these agreements, and yet if you look at the reports on their compliance with these agreements, it's quite low. And I think some of that pressure has come from the outside of Japan. But the reality is that there is a huge overhaul of the judicial system, of the entire legal system in progress. One of the reasons I think foreigners and anybody who's had their human rights abused can't seek recourse is because there are no resources. It's finding a lawyer to take your case. Finding it is very difficult. It's very expensive, and there's so few lawyers in Japan. If you have no access to the legal system and have a remedy in the legal system, then of course you can't have your human rights enforced, and that's the situation currently in Japan. Luckily, the Japanese government, like I said, is undertaking this massive reform, one of the most important changes coming down the pipe is the increase in lawyers. By 2050, they hope to have 50,000 lawyers. Right now, I think it's somewhere around 8,000 lawyers that exist in Japan. 8,000 lawyers for 7 million people approximately.
Okay, that's an interesting issue also, how Japan has sort of been on to keep a sort of surface harmony. They have avoided becoming a litigious society like the U.S. All right, so...
Actually, I think that's a very important point. And believe me, I don't believe in how litigious America has become. But I think without access to the legal system, you cannot have enforcement of legal rights of any sort, whether they're human rights, whether it's dioxin contamination from incinerators, whatever the issue is. It's hard to get a remedy, whatever the case of injury, if there's no place to take your case, and there's nobody to take your case.
Yeah, so there are customary ways of solving problems in Japan involving intermediaries and various things that were not legally based, but just based in custom. And so then comes along like a foreign pressure, which often is needed to change Japan. And for example, recently the United Nations rapporteur on human rights did come to Japan and pointed out certain human rights issues involved.
And I think what we see that happens in all of Japan is, in terms of lack of legal redress, is all the more important in terms of foreigners, because they have the least access to the legal system, and they certainly are people that in some ways are in most need of those protections because of the prejudice, discrimination, and general attitudes towards foreigners that exist.
And so to take one specific issue to what we're dealing with, recently a leading politician named Aso Taro, it's said to her constituency or some people that Japan is ichi minzoku, or means some people translate it as one race, which was very incendiary, but it could also be translated in other ways that the minzoku means more like the same ethnic group. But even so Japan has ethnic minorities, indigenous Ainu people, and that they're not all the same the ethnic group either. That obviously it was a populist the comment, but that kind of thing tends to set off people abroad and make them think that the Japanese may be they're racist, as we heard before. But in a context of domestic politics, then it may not need to be taken too literally. As far as him saying that there is no other country that consists of just one ethnic group like Japan, then that is certainly absurd and uninformed. But that's the kind of thing that that passes in domestic politics, but that only people outsiders then complain about. So in the previous podcast, and so we talked about whether there's some prejudice, discrimination, racism, or xenophobia in Japan generally, and have those definitions available. So do you have any specific comment about whether any of those points are widespread or not?
Well, I would have to agree with Moto Sensei on this, or Professor Moto on this. I think prejudice is widespread. I think discrimination has been reduced, but only, personally, I believe, to the efforts of the legal system and to education. I'd say for a country to have its first discrimination case in 1989 is rather shocking to me. I'm sorry, sexual harassment case in 1989 with the Mitsubishi case. Is quite shocking, but the good news is that I think once a law is passed, it's become well known. Employers understand that they have to comply with the law. Then there is more voluntary compliance in Japan than I think in other countries, for example, America. So I think that's the good news. As far as racism goes, I see it certainly on a weekly basis in terms of comparing stories with friends from other countries that are not Western. And I'd say xenophobia is prevalent as well.
Okay, well, that gives us quite a lot to think about for today. Then I think both sides of the issue from someone with good legal knowledge, Kathy Warden. Okay, well, thank you very much for today, Kathy.
Thank you.